One important thing that has interested researchers in gang activity for the past, about 40 years is trying to understand which comes first. And what I mean by that is when you're looking at gangs and you're looking at criminal behavior of the people in the gangs, do delinquent youths seek out gangs, or is the gang unit a criminogenic peer group? So what this has to do with is the ordering, is temporal ordering. In other words, which came first? Did a youth have to enter into a gang to then start committing crime? Or do youths who are already kind of delinquent and deviant just seek out similar other people, and the crime that goes on amongst them isn't really a result of them hanging out together so much as it's the result of them already being kind of bad and deviant and delinquent? So it's a temporal ordering question. Do delinquent youths seek out gangs, or does becoming a member of a gang actually enhance and increase the amount of crime you're going to commit? Think back to control theory, back to what Hershey said about peers and crime. So if you're a control theorist, you believe that the reason why delinquent peer groups form, things like gangs, is because of the first argument here. If you're a control theorist, you believe that people who already have low social control are going to be fairly delinquent youths. Once they enter into adolescence and young adulthood, they're going to seek out people like them and form gangs and commit crime. It wasn't the gang that caused the crime, in other words, it was them already having kind of a bad pathway into adolescence and adulthood. An alternative explanation, though, is that youths who enter adolescence and young adulthood and enter into gangs become much worse because of being in a gang. There's something about the peer influences, in other words, that has a criminogenic effect. And what that word means, criminogenic, just means it makes them more likely to commit crime. So people have tried to examine this. What comes first, gang membership or criminal activity? And some really interesting research that's got done on this has happened throughout the country, but in particular, a long-term study that got done happened in Denver, Colorado. And what the researchers did in this study is they examined youths entering into gangs. So they had information about people who were gang members both before and after they joined gangs. And they made a couple observations. One observation that they made is the fact that a lot of gang members had prior records, criminal records, prior to joining a gang. So in that way, that kind of sounds like Hershey's ideas and social control theory ideas maybe have some support here. The fact that gang members already had criminal records before even entering a gang indicates that there might not be anything special about the gang itself. It might just be the case that similar youths tend to kind of flock together. But this study in Denver also came up with another kind of interesting piece to add to the puzzle, which is the fact that gang membership actually does increase criminal activity. And once these people exit the gang, and remember we talked about the fact that people don't tend to stay in gangs for a very long time, criminal behavior then decreased. So you have these kind of two conflicting ideas here. On the one hand, we do know the gang members have prior records, but it also doesn't seem like gang membership has no effect. It also seems like gang membership plays a role in worsening and increasing criminal activity, and once you leave the gang, the amount of criminal activity you engage in does seem to go down. So when you think about the different theories that are in play here, control theory would tend to support the fact that many gang members had records prior to joining a gang. But the ideas from things like social learning theory, which really place a lot of importance on peer influences, on learning and getting reinforced from people around you, would probably really like the last bit of information from this study, that there is something about being in the gang that worsens your behavior. So it's kind of an interesting dilemma to come up with in terms of which of these forces is most important. Some other interesting information from research that's been done on gangs, especially this research again in Denver in the late 80s and early 90s, again when gangs were really at their peak in terms of membership and activity, we know that people who are in gangs don't really seem to specialize in any one type of crime. A lot of times, people talk about someone's pathway into becoming a robber or becoming a burglar, becoming a drug dealer. And one thing that we know about youths who are in gangs, which is the group of people that are committing the most offenses, is the fact that they don't really specialize in any one type of crime. And finally, another interesting kind of facet of the research that was done in Colorado is the fact that they gathered information about the gangs that were present in Denver, Colorado, and they were able to track how much of the criminal activity in the Denver, Colorado area you could attribute to specific gangs within the neighborhood. So remember, we talked about one of the problems with understanding gang crime is it's very hard to track these things. Well, in this research study, they made a very concerted effort to go back into criminal records and attribute property and violent crimes to different gangs. And what they found was that a kind of a small percentage of the gangs, about 14% of the gangs in Denver, Colorado, were responsible for almost 80% of all the serious violent crime and about 71% of all of the serious property crime in the Denver, Colorado area during that time frame. So that's kind of an interesting piece of information. First of all, the fact that this very small number of gangs are contributing a large amount to the overall amount of crime, that shouldn't be something that's that foreign of a concept to you guys. If you think back to Wolfgang's idea of there being a small number of offenders committing most of the crime, it seems like it does kind of translate into researching gangs. But also just the sheer number of crimes that they could attribute back to these gangs shows that all of our other estimates of how much crime and violence gangs are responsible for has been a pretty serious underestimate historically. So there's some important myths to kind of dispel about gangs that sometimes emerge in pop culture's representations of them and representations of the people within them. So we're going to go through some of these myths right now. Particularly, we're going to talk about people's kind of preconceived notions about how gangs are organized, how people get recruited into them, and the amount of time that a typical person spends in a gang. One of the kind of myths that's been out there in terms of organization is the idea that gangs are organized just like a Italian mafia family is organized. That there's, a leader, he has an advisor, maybe someone else, and then there's kind of a pyramid structure. Well, hopefully what you've learned today so far is the fact that this is absolutely not true, especially in most street gangs. The organization of your typical street gang is very loosely knit. And the affiliation and communication between members of those gangs is often really sparse, even just going across a city. There are often people that consider themselves members of the same gang who don't even really know each other very well. So the idea that it's closely knit or structured in a way that kind of organized crime families tend to develop really does not seem to be the case. Another interesting myth to kind of talk about has to do with recruitment. A lot of people kind of think about people joining gangs because they kind of aspire to the lifestyle, and there are any number of kind of social media portrayals of why people get involved in gangs. But what we actually know about youths who, have reported their reasons for joining gangs in their neighborhood is the fact that a lot of youths just join them for social and protective reasons. They join them because they want a friend group. They want a group of people that they see as being kind of cool and powerful and maybe dangerous to be around, as being a group that they want to get involved in. They don't, in other words, not a lot of youths join gangs because they want to go out and sling drugs. They want to go out and, shoot people and get into fights. A lot of them actually join gangs for protection because they want to get protected from other people maybe attacking them, and they want to know that if they do ever get attacked or confronted in any way, that they have people who will retaliate with them. And then the final myth to dispel is the myth about how long your typical youth spends in a gang. So, a lot of times when you see gangs portrayed, you see kind of old gang members talking to young, with long, years-long relationships with people in gangs. And one thing that we know is while there are people who remain gang affiliated all their lives, most youths are in gangs for actually less than 1 year. Something really surprising for most people when they first see it, but it's gotten replicated in a lot of different studies looking at gangs that most young kids, young adolescents, young adults really don't have a long time that they actually are active members of gangs. And I think another thing that tends to get misrepresented in pop and media and in pop culture is the idea that leaving the gang sometimes results in that person getting killed or getting beaten up or being kind of disrespected and disgraced. It really isn't the case in your typical street gang. Because there's so much in and out and fluctuation in the people who are in a gang, leaving a gang isn't necessarily a very complicated process. It doesn't get you, for the most part, disrespected amongst those people. A lot of people just prefer to remain kind of gang affiliated and enjoy some of the protection without necessarily being full-fledged members. Of course, one of the reasons why gangs have emerged as such a concern and a cause for research is their growing presence in schools. Now, the information that we get about gangs in schools comes from a supplement of the National Crime Victimization Report. And, one of the reasons why we care about this, why this is a problem, is when people have done research to kind of gauge the amount of gang presence in schools, what they found is schools that have a gang presence, have a readily visible gang presence that other students are aware of. Those schools are also most likely to be places where it's been reported that weapons have been brought into their schools, where, kids within those schools, if asked, will tell researchers that drugs are pretty available at this school. If I wanted to, I know where I could get some X. Some type of drug. And gangs, schools that have a high gang presence also tend to have a lot of violent victimization within their schools. So if you look at the school crime supplement, the National Crime Victimization Study has a really excellent school crime supplement where they go into schools and get very detailed and specific information about incidents where a student has been victimized. And essentially every year they do a nationally representative sample of about 10,000 students in schools between ages 12 and 19. And the way that you get into the study is if you've attended school at some point in the past six months preceding the survey. So what we're going to look at on the next slide is just some data that's been collected from this school crime supplement relating to the presence of gangs in schools. So looking at the school crime supplement, what we know about the presence of gangs in schools is that about 37% of schools in the supplement, that's a random sample of high schoolers throughout the nation, 37% of them report that there's a gang presence in their school. And in terms of characteristics of gangs in schools, what the school crime supplement asked the students in their survey was, how do you know there's a gang in your school? What indicators are out there that have led you to believe that there is a gang presence? And students were given a lot of options, and they would say yes or no, this is present in my school. So just take a look at some of the things that students reported as indicators of gang presence, and you'll see that it kind of fits with with the criteria that we tend to have put in place to define and describe a gang. First of all, about 80% of the students who reported that there was a gang presence in their school said that they knew that because the gang had a name. They knew the name, the people in the gang made that name present and a part of school dialogue. The sheer fact that they could name the gang was an indicator that there was presence in their school. They also talked about the fact that they knew that there was a gang presence in their school because they saw gang members spending predominantly most of their time with other members of the gang. Again, that's 80% of the students say that they can recognize a gang just because those people are always together. And the students also reported that one of the biggest ways they can tell who is and is not in a gang is by clothing or other kind of identifying items. So thinking about going to school and seeing a bunch of people, all kind of wearing the same color t-shirt or the same kind of bandana around their arm or their leg or something. That's kind of what these students were recognizing as indicators that there is a gang presence. And obviously 37% is a fairly high number. The fact that 37% of a random sample of students reported that there's a gang presence in their school is something that caused a lot of alarm, especially for people interested in reducing violence and reducing problems in schools. So there have been some attempts at designing programs to kind of prevent gang violence. This is, getting out of schools and just talking about gangs in general. The epidemic that happened at the end of the 1980s and the early 1990s in terms of gang violence sparked a lot of interest in trying to actually do something about these groups that were responsible for so much of the crime. And one example of a program that's actually been very successful at doing this is a program called Pulling Levers, and it was designed by a criminologist named David Kennedy in the 1990s in Boston. So let me just give you a very quick description of what Pulling Levers was all about. Essentially what was going on in Boston in the mid-1990s is not only were they having a homicide epidemic, but they were having a handgun homicide epidemic. There was an incredibly large number of young adolescent inner-city males dying on a monthly basis from illegally or legally obtained handguns. And what David Kennedy and several officials within the city of Boston decided is they were going to try to stage an intervention, and they called it Pulling Levers because they had every kind of member of government, court, social work get together and design this program. So essentially what they did, this is 1996, summer of 1996 in Boston. David Kennedy got together with the police chief in Boston and had them identify really the major players in terms of gang violence in Boston. They had the police department come up with really the 10 most violent, most troublesome gangs. Usually, in this case, the police know who the gang leaders are of these gangs. So Kennedy and the other members of this group rounded up all of the gang leaders in Boston in 1996. They essentially forced these gang members to get together in the gym of a high school, sat them down, and explained to them that from now on, homicide, especially handgun homicides, have to stop. Because if they don't stop, the police, social work, the court system, probation, parole are going to pull every lever possible and hit offenders with every possible punishment in the book. So essentially what these people were doing is they were telling the gang leaders, look, get the word out. We're still going to do business as usual and prosecute other crimes, but if we find out that a homicide can be traced back to your gang, we are going to take every member of your gang that we know about off the streets. If any of them have anything outstanding against them, if they have child support they haven't paid, if they haven't been showing up for parole, anything against them, we are going to hit them hard with every kind of punishment we can. This is kind of like the ultimate deterrence program, because what they were trying to do is really target a specific type of crime, let the people who are committing the crime know that the punishments are about to get much, much more severe, and then see if that has an effect. You think about it, it's actually a pretty cheap program to implement. They're not really expecting to actually have to enact these kind of punishments on a lot of people. They're hoping that just the threat of the punishment will be enough. And what happened in Boston in the following couple years is an incredible drop in handgun homicides. So, Kennedy and everybody else in Boston saw it as a real success, and people have taken that model and put it into Indianapolis, Stockton, California, a couple other places, and they've really been able to achieve a decent amount of success. It's kind of hard to maintain it over a long period of time, but it really is seen as one of the few kind of gang prevention, at least in terms of gang violence prevention programs out there, that's actually been fairly effective. Okay, so your discussion this week, I just wanted to talk about it one last time. You're going to be reading an excerpt, which is on Blackboard, from Stanley Tookie Williams's autobiography. Autobiography's title is Blue Rage, Black Redemption. So make sure you get your discussion done. And on Thursday, we are watching a video in class about two uh, ex ex-cons in Baltimore called Omar and Pete. It's a documentary that got filmed about 6 years ago now. All right, so I will see you Thursday.